We are going to start. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susana Varria. I am the Asia Pacific Trade Justice campaigner with the Global Trade Union Federation called Public Services International. And on behalf of the organizers, I welcome all of you to this press conference titled ASEAN's Fate Hangs in a Rcep Balance. This event is co-organized by Focus on the Global South, Indonesia for Global Justice, Asia Pacific Forum on Law, Women, Law and Development, GREEN, Public Services International, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. And we are all very happy to have you with us. To start with, we will go with a few technical announcements, and I think you can see the slides that are being projected. Please go ahead with the slides. The slides are not moving on my screen. Rules. So please keep yourself muted at all times. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand using the function in the application to signal that you would like to speak, and I will call on you to speak after the speakers have made their presentations. If you have any questions on technical issues or any other questions, please write them in the chat box, and our technical team will help you with those queries. We have interpretation into Bahasa for this event, and you can choose to use this language by clicking on the interpretation icon that is at the bottom of your screen. So these are for the technical indications. So today we are having a very important discussion. The world's largest free trade area, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, was signed in November, bringing together 15 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And it is currently in the process of being enacted in different countries. And it will come into force once at least 9 countries have ratified or enacted it. And however, in these important times, there are only very few studies that are looking at the impacts based on the actual text. The text was also released very late. And today we have the privilege to be able to discuss a new study by the Boston University that is in many ways of very superior quality than compared to earlier studies, because it does exactly this. It looks at the Rcep based on the actual text, focusing on the goods chapter. And it also is of superior quality because of the methodology it uses compared to earlier studies. And we will be discussing these aspects and how and the results of the study, as well as the implications. And for that, we have today 3 eminent speakers with us. We have Dr. Rashmi Banga, who is Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We have Dr. Ika Riswanti, who is Associate Professor at Universitas Diponegoro in Indonesia. And we have Joshua Mata, who is the General Secretary of the National Labor Center, Centro, in the Philippines. So I welcome all of them. It's really great to have Dr. Rashmi Banga with us, as she was involved in this study and gives it really the weight of a long history of work on economic issues at UNCTAD. So we were going to start, and we're going to start with Dr. Rashmi. Please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And the study that I'm going to present today, like you mentioned, it has been published by Boston University. If someone could just run my slides. So this study has been co-authored with Kevin Kelker, who is a professor in Boston University, and Prerna Sharma. Next slide, please. We all know that developing countries are facing multiple challenges. We have COVID-19. Along with that, COVID-19 has led to economic, financial, and uh, uh, a recession, a global recession. Along with that, we have climate change crisis. So when developing countries are facing these multiple crises, at these times, it is important to know whether an FTA can really help the governments in reviving their economies and facing these challenges successfully. Next slide. So if you look at UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report that was published in 2020, the report says that global economy will have a K-shaped recovery. Wealthy people will recover, will have a V-shaped recovery, while others will struggle to revive their economies. What we find is that developing countries are more vulnerable and are expected to economically be hit harder, and so they will take more time to recover. While billions and trillions of dollars are being rolled out as rescue measures in developing countries, these rescue measures are not more than 5% of the GDP as compared to 30% of GDP in developed countries. Next slide, please. What we find, so what is the rationale for a developing country to sign an FTA in the times of COVID-19? A country would want to increase its market access in its partner countries because increased exports can generate additional output and employment. FTA can also lead to increase in cheaper imports of items which are not produced in the country. But if FTA increases your imports more than your exports and worsens your balance of trade, this can have adverse impact on the GDP growth as well as employment in the country, and it will make it more difficult for the governments to revive their economies post-pandemic. This can also lead to loss of tariff revenue and policy space to regulate the imports of luxury items into the countries. So tariffs are a very simple and effective tool in the hands of the government, not only to raise revenue, but also to regulate imports of luxury items, especially in the times of COVID-19. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at Rcep, we know that ASEAN countries already have an existing FTA with all the non-ASEAN partners in the Rcep. Even the non-ASEAN countries are either they have an FTA amongst themselves or they are negotiating an FTA. So for Rcep to give additional market access to ASEAN countries, it would mean that it cuts into the sensitive lists or already existing sensitive lists of the countries. Next slide. Now to estimate, next slide. To estimate the impact of tariff liberalization in Rcep, the methodology that we use is smart simulations. Now these simulations, this is the only methodology which provides the impact of tariff liberalization at the country level as well as at the product level and at a very disaggregated product level, that is 6-digit level. There is no other methodology which can provide these disaggregated, these results to this extent of disaggregation. This is also the only methodology that can take account of limited, conditional, or selective liberalization. It takes into account sensitive lists and tariff rate quotas, and then it can give the estimates with respect to balance of trade, exports, and imports. We use all the latest data available for our RCEP countries, and the simulations are done for the year 2019. Next slide. Now, if you look at the results, next slide, please. Now, before I go to the results, just have a quick look at the existing studies on RCEP. Almost all the existing studies use a computable general equilibrium model, which is the CGE model. But CGE model has been heavily criticized in economic literature because of its unrealistic assumptions. It assumes perfect competition. It assumes full employment of labor and capital all over the world. It also assumes that government budgets are always balanced. Now we know that this doesn't really happen. So what this methodology assumes is that if there is tariff revenue loss, governments will be able to raise this loss through internal taxes. There are many studies, including from Kevin Gallagher, that in developing countries, the lost tariff revenues are permanent. The governments are never able to recover their lost revenues. It also assumes that all products are unique. That means rice produced in one country can never be substituted totally by rice produced in other countries. So these are very unrealistic assumptions on which the CG models runs. And so the results of the CG models should be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, the CG model also provides results at an aggregate level. So there are aggregation biases. So at the sector level, you will get the impact and you will not be able to take account of the negotiations on the sensitive list that have taken place within a FTA. Next slide. So in our methodology, we have been able to do that. We have looked at the 6-digit HS combined nomenclature, how many tariff lines have been protected by different countries. Now, tariff line needs to be protected in developing countries, especially in those products which have development challenges. But what we find is that Japan has negotiated Rcep with the highest number of tariff lines under limited liberalization, that is 1324, followed by Korea, which is 912 tariff lines which are protected, Cambodia 856, and China 832. Next slide. If you look at the import coverage, 21% of Japan's imports have been protected by sensitive lists, tariff rate quotas, and conditional liberalization, while in New Zealand it is 28% and Korea 17%. Next slide. Now, taking account of the tariff, the limited liberalization, what we find is that if you look at the balance of trade pre-Rcep and post-Rcep, ASEAN will lose 6% per annum. This is the last row. I think this is not visible in the slide. ASEAN will lose 6% per annum. The balance of trade of ASEAN as a whole worsens by 6.1%. While Japan will be the net gainer, Japan's balance of trade improves by almost $11.9 billion, which is 99% of its existing balance of trade with Rcep countries. We also find that all ASEAN countries, almost all ASEAN countries, the balance of trade will worsen. Malaysia will lose $4 billion per annum post Rcep, while Cambodia will lose $2.3 billion per annum. We also find that other countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, they all are facing a worsening of their balance of trade post Rcep. And this is taking into account the sensitive list and tariff rate quotas. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at, next slide. Now, if you look at the change in imports, we find that increase in ASEAN's import is of 1%, while you will see that imports increase in all ASEAN countries. Imports are rises. The rise in import is maximum for China, which is 11.4 billion, followed by Korea 6.3 billion, Malaysia 3.7 billion. Next slide. Now, if you look at where is the imports coming, or from where is the imports coming, what we find is that because of Rcep, intra-ASEAN trade might be adversely impacted. Imports from other ASEAN countries go down, while imports from China increase in almost all ASEAN countries. Next slide. If you look at Philippines or Thailand or Vietnam, you will find that from other ASEAN countries, the imports are negative. But if you look at change in China's imports, it is interesting to note that China's imports from ASEAN countries will go down, but it increases from Japan and Korea. So what you really find is that ASEAN countries are not going to get additional market access into China, while imports from China increase in ASEAN countries. For China, imports increase from Japan and Korea. Next slide, please. So in terms of the products, what we find is that the products where the imports increase maximum are textile and clothing, vehicles, electrical machinery and mechanical appliances, and agricultural products. So in the paper gives the details at the 6-digit disaggregated level as to which products are being imported into the countries and from which partner countries. Next slide. Now, if you look at change in exports, what we find is ASEAN as a whole, while ASEAN's imports increased by 1%, ASEAN's exports increased by only 0.1%. And in terms of exports, the net gainer is Japan, Korea, and China. If you look at the percentage share of Japan, in the increase in total exports within Rcep countries, it is almost 58%. Next slide. So coming to the tariff revenue loss, when you have tariff liberalization in an FTA, tariffs go down to zero in many tariff lines. But tariffs are a very simple and effective policy tools in the hands of the government to generate revenue. And in the times of crisis, tariff revenue becomes very important because tariffs not just generate revenue, but also help in preserving valuable domestic financial resources from being spent on imports of luxury items. Next slide. What we find, our results show that tariff revenue loss will be almost 3.8 billion per annum for ASEAN countries as a whole. Malaysia loses 2.1 billion per annum, while countries like Thailand loses 800 million, Cambodia 334 million, and Vietnam 192 million per annum. Next slide. So overall, the broad conclusions that come from the study is that in the times of crisis, especially multiple crises, countries need to preserve their policy and fiscal space. FTAs like Rcep will restrict countries' policy and fiscal space. The tariff revenues will go down, and also the policy space in terms of regulating imports is lost to the countries. The SMART estimates show that ASEAN countries' imports post Rcep will rise more than their exports, leading to worsening of their balance of trade. Imports of luxury and unproductive items like motor vehicles and defense equipments rise. And it is very important that governments generate additional revenues to revive their economy, but in this case, they will lose even their existing revenues. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banga. I think your presentation really highlights the dangers of disagreement um, with the possibilities of undermining trade and economic prospects for the ASEAN region, while actually what is required is recovery. And the loss of government revenue is really stark. To give a comparison, the estimated loss in tariff revenue is actually significantly higher than the entire wage bill of the total number of the nurses that are currently employed in countries like Malaysia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. And for Cambodia, the tariff revenue as 334 million US dollars per year is almost the same as the national public spending on health for that country. So these are actually really worrying outcomes of this study. So I would like now to invite Dr. Eka Rispanti, who is really an expert in international law and on financial issues also, to comment on the outcomes of the study, give her perspective, and I think also specifically on what this would mean for Indonesia. Thank you, Dr. Rispanti, to be with us.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Dr. Rashmi, for presenting your research, and it's give new informations about what will be in the post Rcep. Well, I have 2 points that I would like to deliver on your responded your study in the context of regional value chains and in the context of rules of origin. The first, that to add the analysis from the study conducted by Dr. Banga, that the increase in post RCEP import experienced by ASEAN countries is not in line with the regional value chains that will be created in the post-Rcep for ASEAN countries. And in post-Rcep, ASEAN country will enter into asymmetric competition, of course, with non-ASEAN member state that has more efficient comparative advantage. And according to Dr. Banga's studies, the major gainer of Rcep is a country that is a country like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Especially, I would like to address about the cumulations of origins that it believe will be benefiting more to what the country with developed industrial sectors. In this point, the cumulations of origins I associated with the semi-finished and finished product that need an industrial processing and capital and also know-how. Instead of increasing export based on the study, post RCEP, the ASEAN country also will face increase of import. In this regard, the industrial structures of ASEAN countries are not industry that produce the finished good. It will, it will make the ASEAN countries becoming instead of the production basis, it will be the market basis from the leading industrial countries under the ASEP. For example, I put a highlight on the textile and clothing industries that you are mentioned in your study. We know that in Indonesia, textile and clothing are contribute like 5.4% of our gross national income. And now we have post-COVID conditions where many of industry are closed and unable to develop their productions capacities and capabilities. Therefore, I think this industry will be in the position as a vulnerable industry. It will be difficult for this industry to benefit from what we call as a value-added product. Well, in the end, I think the industrial countries like China, Japan, and Australia, and also New Zealand, they will be the major player to fulfill the import market. Needless to say that countries that benefit from regional value chain scheme from the RCEP are countries that already has their know-how, technology, and have their strong brand, especially for finished product. And ASEAN itself, ASEAN member state itself, as the main target of their product. There is a possibility that country with an underdeveloped of industrialization level will become only a place for semi-finished product productions by looking at the low labor wages, or maybe for the taxation facilities that more easy and cheaper. And then regarding the rules of origins under the RCEP, we know that in the trades of goods, in order to obtain the reduced import duty facility under the RCEP, the exporter must be able to show the nationality of good. Issues regarding the nationality of good are also related to several things. For instance, existing of spaghetti balls of rules of origins due to the existing FTA that now in ASEAN there are some existing FTA. The rules of origin under the RCEP itself now has been claimed to be a solutions with the single certifications to be a solutions of the spaghetti ball phenomena under the mega FTA in ASEAN. There is a potential of, I think there will be a potential of trade circumventions in order to obtain the tariff preferences from the aspect of good nationality. This potential, I think, will be a hidden cost for the RCEP related to to rules of origins, especially for countries, for ASEAN countries, for instance, Indonesia. There can be an opportunities for trade circumventions, such as fraud of origins, potential loss of state revenue, and also asymmetric trade competitions. This is also as mentioned in the Dr. Banga presentations. Actually, all the point that I already mentioned is in line with the Dr. Rashmi study, where post RCP there will be a shift in the trade in favor of more efficient exporting within RCP, where the decline in intra-ASEAN trade as ASEAN countries import for more efficient exporter instead for other ASEAN countries. For instance, Indonesia export will be declined in post-RCP to many other RCP country. As the other country import for more efficient exporter will be increased. In terms of the idea of the RCP that potentially can drive the development of or the economic growth of micro, small, and medium enterprise, yet the ASEAN countries need to look back more issue faced by this economic operator related to the rules of origin utilizations. Although RCEP has provided several preferential tariff, for instance, the level of services in the trade facilitations, for instance, service automatizations, and then high cost of compliance, quota restrictions, and also issue of tax reform. I think we need, ASEAN countries need to assess about the impact of RCP before it's ratified, especially regarding the rules of origin, because it's need to mitigate the impact toward the economic, social, and human rights due to the asymmetric trade competitions. I think that's all, Susanna, my response toward the Dr. Banga studies. So there is 2 points, regional value chains and also the rules of origins under the RECP.
Thank you so much, Dr. Risvanti. I think you highlighted very well the question of also the challenges to ASEAN integration, which is not only a question of simple integration, but also what kind of integration we want, and that shift from being a region in which there is production that is interlinked to one where it's only a market and where the different actors take advantage without really contributing to shared prosperity in the region. So very, I think, worrying trends also that you were able to identify. So thank you very much for that. And I would like now to invite our third speaker for today, Joshua Mata, who is from the trade union movement based in the Philippines. And I think will also speak to us about what the implications are for jobs and employment. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you, Susanna. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. First of all, thanks for the presentation. It really is very important what Rashmi has done. In particular, we are very, very glad that we're finally moving away from the CGE model. As you probably know, this model, which is very simplistic, has been abused several times by even our own government in order to justify signing into FTAs that eventually turned out to be bad for the country. So that in itself makes this study very, very important and worthwhile for our policymakers to actually read. But more importantly, the study clearly shows that the ASEAN doesn't have any gains, no, when it signs on to Rcep and implements this. Particularly when you look at specifically when you look at the market provisions, the market access provisions of this, and this is very worrisome because we all know that we are all suffering from a massive jobs crisis, and therefore, if the study, which says if the study proves to be correct, that it actually would lead to local markets being flooded by imports, then that would only add to more problems to the labor markets of many countries that are already reeling from the pandemic. As according to the ILO, as of December this year, about 81 million jobs have been lost in Asia and the Pacific. That's in December. Could have grown more, no, by today. In the Philippines, about 4 million have lost their jobs. But some actually say that this could be more. In fact, much more. Some are saying it's perhaps even 10 million. And the thing is, if the Philippines signs on to the RCEP, then that means this jobs crisis, well, this treaty would hardly help the country in solving the jobs crisis. A very specific point, case in point, which is actually very interesting. The study revealed that one of the biggest imports that we could expect that could flood the country has to do with the importation of arms and ammunitions into the Philippines. Now, that's right. No, I mean we can debate the social value of these products if you want, but the thing is, it's going to flood the country. It would not only threaten the country's own capacity to manufacture guns, like for example, Armscor is one of the biggest companies in the Philippines, which employs about 1,700 workers. Now, what happens to those jobs? No, if this happen, if their market is taken over by importation, um, not to mention that what actually happens to this country, which is already suffering from extreme violence, if you have more guns running around the country. So that's really very alarming, no? And to think that the market issue is just one of the many other problems in this agreement. No? In particular, we can talk about investments that are very, very problematic, even if they say that it doesn't have this controversial ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Agreement. Even if it says it doesn't include that, it also says that eventually they would have to review it. No? And I think unless countries actually come up with legislation that says that their governments can never agree to any investor state dispute settlement mechanisms to be in any of the treaties, then there's always the threat that this concept can eventually be introduced into the region. There's the problem with e-commerce, which of course if you read it, it's really unenforceable. But the fact that it is there, I think is also worrisome. And then this is and this is maybe this is lesser known, no? At least for many workers, no. This is the first free trade agreement in the region that actually contains government procurement. So again, if you recall the debate in the WTO, government procurement is a very contentious issue, but now they have managed to sneak it into the RCEP. So if you look at the study and then combine it with all the other issues that we are facing in terms of RCEP, then then the inevitable conclusion could only be the fact that there is really no reason for us to ratify this. And finally, I'd also like to echo what was said earlier, that it is imperative. So with this study, it is now imperative for many governments to actually come up with its independent impact assessment, particularly the impact of RCEP on the social, environmental, the climate, as well as health and labor, as well as human rights. That has to be presented by the government in a fairly objective manner to its own people before it signs on to Rcep. After all, in the past 7 or 8 years, they have kept everyone in every country in the dark about what's happening. So now that it is already signed, before they ratify this, it is their duty to open up the text of Rcep and enable their people to actually understand how this will impact on them. So again, let me just reiterate. For us in the labor movement, the message is very clear. There is no reason for us to ratify Rcep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I think the argument around employment is very strong, considering that we have already seen so many losses, and it's difficult to understand how the economic situation will be normalized if there will be an agreement that will actually lead to lesser exports, more imports, and that in itself will have impacts again on. So we are now going to move to questions. We invite, please, media people from the media to come forward, raise your hand if you would like to speak directly. There is already one question that is there in the chat box, which is directed at Dr. Rashmi. If you would like to speak directly, I think the question is from media person from Kusyafid Kufozi from Malaysia, or otherwise I can just read it out for you. The question is, can you please elaborate on the impacts of Rcep to Malaysia, as seems to be the most impacted country in terms of
Okay, the study gives, a very detailed disaggregated results with respect to each country, including Malaysia. What we find in Malaysia is that the balance of trade of Malaysia worsens by $4 billion per annum. That means your imports are higher than exports post Rcep. Imports rise by 1.8 billion from China and around 500 million from Japan. So Malaysia's imports are mainly coming from China post Rcep, and the products are electrical machinery and vehicles and parts thereof. Also, in terms of exports, Malaysia post Rcep, our results show that will experience a decline in its exports. So when you are talking about Rcep and increased market access, what the results show is that there will be a decline in Malaysia's exports to Rcep countries by 0.3%, but definitely a decline. And in terms of the tariff revenue loss, it is going to be $2.1 billion. Now, just to give you an idea of the scope of this tariff revenue loss, if you look at the cost of the cost of vaccinating the entire population of Malaysia, it is less than this tariff revenue loss. So it is $2.1 billion, and we know that developing countries are facing a lot of problems in WTO in terms of getting the TRIPS waiver. And so given all these circumstances, it becomes very important for countries like Malaysia to take an informed decision with respect to ratifying Rcep. If you want more details in terms of Malaysia, I think the paper gives you at 6-digit disaggregated level where the imports will come from which partner country post Rcep. There was also a question in the chat which I want to pick up, I think, which is important. Now, the question is, when will these Rcep results materialize? Now, according to our methodology, what we have done is that any tariff line which has limited liberalization with respect to sensitive list or TRQ or a conditional liberalization, we have removed those tariff lines from the impact analysis. So if on a particular product, the tariffs goes down to 0 after 20 years, we have assumed that it does not go down to 0 after 20 years. We have assumed that that tariff line is fully protected. So given that assumption, the moment the Rcep is ratified and implemented, all these results will hold true. Thank you. Over to you, Susanna.
Thank you very much. You already also answered the second question I was going to put to you, and we have one hand that is up. There is one more question that had been posed before, which was related to India. I will read that to you once. Sorry.
Yes, I have seen that question. How much in terms of India's gains of remaining out of Rcep? Now, our study has not taken into account India because India is not in Rcep. I think India has taken a very informed decision of remaining out of Rcep. But in the study, we have quoted a study done by some authors with respect to gains to India of remaining out of Rcep. I think you can read the study and look at the gains to India. But in my analysis, we have not taken India into account.
Perfect. There is one hand up. Sangeeta, I'm sorry, I'm making you wait, but there were some questions already in the chat. And also, I think Rosen had asked earlier about the time period, and there is a follow-up question about any insights from sanitary and phytosanitary. Will ASEAN countries win or lose due to this? Dr. Banga, if you would like to respond. I don't know if Dr. Risvanti, you would like to intervene at some point also on any of these questions also, please feel free. Same for you, Joshua. But we'll start with Dr. Rashmi, yes.
Yes, this study looks into the market access, the goods chapter in Rcep. So only the market access chapter has been analyzed, and estimates are based on exports and imports. So I would not want to comment on SPS issues in Rcep.
Okay. Then I would like to ask Sangeeta to take the floor. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your questions? Yes.
Susanna, maybe I would like to add about the questions about the sanitary and phytosanitary issue.
Yes, please go ahead. Sorry.
From my perspective, from my legal perspective, regarding the sanitary and phytosanitary issue, of course, it will be one of the obstacle for, especially for ASEAN's member states, for instance, Indonesia, and maybe for Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, because the issue on the SPS, it will be give more benefit for a country that have an advanced technology. They already have the a good risk management related to trade, and also automatizations in trade facilitations. I'm afraid that the issue of sanitary and phytosanitary will be one of the issue on non-tariff measures that undermine the benefit of the FTA. Susanna, thank you.
I seem to have some apology.
I think Susanna is having, oh, Susanna?
Yes, I'm sorry. I seem to have some connection issues on my side. Thank you very much for your response, Dr. Risvanti. And I'll now give the floor then to Sangeeta, please.
Hello, hi. Okay, I have a few questions. I'm from Cambodia, so I've got a few questions based on Cambodia's imports and exports. You based on the data that you've shared with us, it would seem like the tariff you know what I mean, is going to affect the textile and the clothing sector. In Cambodia, this is actually one of the largest industrial or manufacturing sector here. So seeing that it's going to affect import tariffs, do you see, what are the firstly, what are the direct and indirect effect on the economy and on labor? Secondly, is there any bright spot that we can actually see from this? Is there any looking on the bright side kind of thing in terms of Rcep for Cambodia? Secondly, why the fact that Cambodia has also got some FTAs in place, the recent one being China, and there are also plans with an FTA with South Korea. How is that going to be beneficial for Cambodia in terms or in relation to Rcep? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a few more questions that have come, so I think we can also group them in case you would like to take a few of them together. There is one more question about Rcep being described as a lesser quality trade agreement than the CPTPP. And if the good markets impacts from weaker trade agreement is so severe, then what to expect from the CPTPP, in case you would like to take that question also. There is a question to all panelists about the Rcep possibility that it would undermine positive outcomes from the waiver, the TRIPS waiver that has been proposed, considering that Rcep reasserts TRIPS provisions. And a reminder that this has been a very important issue for Indonesia that has been supporting the waiver very strongly. So if you would like to take 2 or 3 of these questions, and then I can also ask Dr. Rika to respond to the question that is specific to her. And also just regarding the previous question on SPS, we decided to have these sessions really focused on the goods trade. But if we have further discussions or another press conference where we discuss those other issues, then of course we will let you know.
Thank you, Susanna. On the questions on Cambodia about textile and clothing, what our results show is that with tariff liberalization and taking into account whatever sensitive lists have been negotiated by Cambodia, we still find that there will be increase in imports in this sector. And if these imports displace the current production within the textile and clothing sector, then there can be indirect impacts on the total output of that sector as well as employment of that sector. So definitely increased imports, if they displace the existing output in a particular sector, can have an adverse implication on labor and employment. Now, Cambodia is signing FTAs with Korea, and I think it is very important for the governments to take an informed decisions in terms of where the gains are. So if they think that they are able to export more than what their imports will be, there will be a positive balance of trade for them. Then it makes a very good sense, and there are many positives to get into an FTA. But taking Cambodia's case and taking the case of Rcep, it doesn't really clearly show that Cambodia is going to have any additional market access. With separate FTA with Korea, there might be higher market access for Cambodia, but it will all depend on what is really negotiated among these FTAs. On the question on CPTPP, there is a study that we have undertaken on CPTPP and its impact for the countries. It is also now important to look at Rcep and also look at CPTPP, and if CPTPP precedes Rcep, then some market access gains that countries are expecting from Rcep may materialize in CPTPP and may not really materialize because of Rcep. I think that dynamic should also be considered by the governments. And there is a study, I think it is available on internet, you could check. There's a study on CPTPP and its impact on different countries using the similar smart simulation methodology. So, thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rika, there are, I think, 2 questions for you. One is that there is an assertion that Rcep would facilitate more investment coming from non-Rcep countries. because they want to, of course, maximize market access opening. Can you comment on the relationship between foreign direct investment and rules of origin? And there was a second question, I believe. Or at least you could start with this one, please.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Related to the foreign direct investment in the post Rcep, I think it will increase from non Rcep countries because of the opening market and the benefit of the tariff preferences that might they get if they establish a company, or for instance, or factory or production base within the Rcep member countries. And they will get, I think, they can also access some facility under the Rcep, but we need to look back whether this FDI actually is like, it's like, for me, the FDI it might will not really good for ASEAN itself, because the FDI from the non-member RCEP countries who actually got the benefit from the market access rather than the RCEP countries itself. This is what I call as the trade circumventions. We know that under the Rcep there's also some tariff differentials for certain Rcep member state, and I'm afraid that this kind of FDI might undermining the benefit that should be delivered for the beneficiary countries. And the FDI and the rules of origin, I think rules of origins, if it is if it is employed by the third country to take the benefit of the FTA under the trade agreement of the FTA under the Rcep, it might cause undermining the economic benefit for the RCEP member state. Susanna.
Thank you very much. There was also a specific question about Indonesia and about what specific products will be imported into Indonesia from RCEP countries, and what amount of Indonesian trade balance deficit will arise from the signing of this RCEP. Would you like to take that, or should I request Dr. Rashmi?
Maybe I will just answer short about the Indonesia. There's an issue in Indonesia regarding the e-commerce, that there is a lot of clothing import through the e-commerce, and also the issue of the ball press from some neighborhood country in ASEAN and also in non-ASEAN entering Indonesia, and it caused a market distortion from the clothing market, and the clothing market itself already distorted because of the increase of e-commerce, and some producer of clothing in Indonesia, they already asked the government to implement the safeguard article to protect our domestic industry. Susanna.
Yes, thank you very much. These are very important elements to bring into this discussion. Dr. Rashmi?
Yes, for Indonesia, I was just checking the products where the imports rise come under textile and clothing, articles of iron and steel, meat products, and copper articles. So these are the products which will face increase in imports in Indonesia. And I think my slide also shows that the increase will be mainly from China and Australia, and imports will also increase, will actually decline from other ASEAN countries in Indonesia. I would also like to comment on, the expectation of the governments that with an FTA, the foreign direct investments will increase. Now, given the digitalization that is taking place, the foreign firms, the drivers of FDI have really changed. It will really, if the foreign firms are coming into the country, it will really look at I don't think it's going to be low labor cost or low tariffs, which are going to be the main drivers of FDI. It will be much beyond that. It will be the rules and regulations. It will be the kind of digital infrastructure and digital skills that exists within a country. And given automation, we already know that global value chains are becoming shorter, and EU has also declared industrial sovereignty as one of its objectives. So there will be a lot of outshoring of manufacturing into the home countries. So expecting that liberalizing tariffs will invite or encourage more FDI into the country, I think the governments need to really rethink on this decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashmi, again, for reminding us of that myth of the investments coming in, which has not been really realized. We are going to reach the end of the time we had allocated for this press conference, and I just want to ask once more if there is any final questions. You can find our press release online, and the link has just been shared. There is one question about the estimates, the effects that there will be for small-scale business producers, farmers, fishing producers. So how the SMEs and local markets will be impacted. And maybe just also, yes, please, if you would like to respond to that first. That's the final question. Dr. Rashmi, would you like to answer the question about the estimated effects on small-scale business producers?
Okay, sorry, I thought the question was posed to someone else. Yes, when the imports, it will, I think it's very important for countries to look at where the imports are going to come, which sectors and which products the imports will be. If it is going to be low-skilled, products are imported are mainly in the low-skilled sectors, then that can really impact on SMEs and as well as on the employment of low-skilled labor. For example, we find that textile and clothing is one of the sectors where imports will rise in almost all ASEAN countries. And I think this is one sector where you have SMEs and you have unskilled labor. And also a lot of, a big informal economy exists in textile and clothing sector. Also in some of the agricultural products where the imports are going to rise in different countries, for example, in Thailand. So these imports will definitely impact if they are not compensated by increased in exports in other sectors, then they are definitely going to have a very adverse impact on SMEs and on the employment of the country overall.
Thank you very much. Joshua, would you like to also come in on this question or any other comments that you would like to make as your final comments?
Very quickly about the MSMEs. I actually forgot to mention in my intervention earlier that it is going to be impacted, and if there's a surge in imports like what is predicted by the study, then they would obviously be at the losing end of the whole thing. But here's the point that I wanted to emphasize. The Rcep is essentially something that's it's the latest variant of what is already an outmoded and a flawed development model, which I think should be questioned in the first place. The whole pandemic has shown us that the global value chain that the dominant economic model is trying to promote, where they try to integrate small scale and medium scale enterprises into the whole value chain, is actually very fragile. And and it's questionable. No? So I think now that we are in a pandemic, we are in a perfectly good situation now to question these models and put forward development models that are more akin to what we have, that fits the situation of each country.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I think these are very good concluding comments to expanding the discussion back to the fact that though today we discussed the chapters that is related to goods, Rcep is much more encompassing than that. And experts have really highlighted that there are several provisions in Rcep that would lead to government losing the ability to make policy decisions in the public interest, and that loss of policy space is even more dangerous in a question in a moment of pandemic recovery. The question that was raised about the TRIPS waiver and the fact that in RCEP, the TRIPS has been reaffirmed. So now if there was a waiver at the World Trade Organization, then it could potentially be undermined by countries having signed RCEP. And we know that in the region, countries like Indonesia have been very strongly supporting the waiver. So conflicting interests actually coming in the way. So thank you very much, everyone, for your very important comments and questions, and of course for our three excellent speakers. And also thank you to all the work that has been done by the co-organizers and the technical team and the interpreters. And with that, have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.